The summer that brought our lives crashing down around us began, of all places, with the attic. My wife, Jessica, and I had just closed on the house that spring. It was a narrow, slightly weathered, two-story colonial, sitting on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. It boasted a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and a backyard that the real estate listing had cleverly photographed to look twice its actual size. It wasn't a luxury property by any stretch of the imagination, but it possessed a specific, undeniable charm. It felt exactly like the kind of house that a young couple was supposed to grow into. A place where you could vividly picture chaotic toddler birthday parties spilling out of the kitchen and a golden retriever tearing through the uncut grass. Jessica fell in love with the place the moment we pulled into the driveway, and because I loved her, I liked that she loved it. We threw ourselves into making it ours, painting walls, sanding floors, and assembling cheap furniture until our hands were blistered. By June, the only part of the property we hadn't confronted was the attic. It wasn't a walk-up. It was accessible only by one of those treacherous, steep wooden ladders that pull down from a trapdoor in the hallway ceiling. Every time I dared to open the hatch, a wall of superheated air would spill down into the hallway, feeling as though an industrial furnace had been left running up there since the Reagan administration. It was packed to the rafters with forgotten cardboard boxes left behind by the previous owners, draped in loose fiberglass insulation that looked as though it had been violently rearranged by a family of nesting raccoons. Jessica, ever the optimist, kept assuring me that we would dedicate a weekend to cleaning it out eventually. But the Midwestern summer arrived with a brutal, humid suddenness. Our jobs grew demanding, and life simply got in the way. And then her mother moved in. Her name was Margaret. Even now, just saying her name out loud leaves a strange metallic taste in my mouth. For the entirety of my marriage to Jessica, Margaret had existed at a polite, manageable distance. She was a fixture of Thanksgiving dinners, the occasional awkwardly polite weekend visit, and brief holiday phone calls. She was the quintessential mother-in-law, always perfectly composed, impeccably dressed, even on a Sunday morning, and radiating a quiet, subtle intimidation. She wasn't unkind, but she was guarded. But that year, the guardrails of her life vanished. Her divorce was finalized in early May. Margaret and Jessica's father had been married for 35 years. When a marriage of that immense length finally breaks, it rarely does so quietly, and this was no exception. It ended disastrously. Her father immediately relocated to Scottsdale, Arizona, hand in hand with a woman who was 2 decades his junior. Almost overnight, Margaret was left adrift in a massive, silent house in the suburbs, with nowhere she actively wanted to be. So Jessica did exactly what Jessica always did. She threw the front door wide open. "It'll just be for a few weeks, maybe a month," she told me one night in the master bathroom, talking around her toothbrush. "Just until she gets her bearings and figures out what she wants to do next." I remember looking at her through the mirror and offering a casual shrug. "That's completely fine," I said. And the truth was, I genuinely meant it. At first, it really was fine. Margaret arrived and moved into our tiny downstairs guest room, with just 2 suitcases and a calm, polite smile that looked entirely practiced and entirely hollow. She was the model house guest. She thanked us profusely, almost too much. She cooked elaborate dinners on weeknights, scrubbed baseboards that didn't need scrubbing, and constantly tried to make herself useful. But the very first thing I noticed about this new version of Margaret was her profound, heavy quietness. Jessica and I had been practically inseparable since our sophomore year of college. The life we had built together was naturally loud and vibrant. We always had a Spotify playlist echoing through the kitchen while we chopped vegetables. The television was perpetually humming in the background. Our friends had an open-door policy, dropping by unannounced for beers on the porch. Margaret, however, moved through our chaotic home like a ghost, trying desperately not to disturb the air currents. Occasionally, I would wake up at the crack of dawn to get a glass of water, only to find her already sitting out on the back patio. She would just sit there with a steaming mug of black coffee clasped in both hands, staring blankly out at the dew-soaked grass as if she were waiting for instructions on how to exist. My primary emotion toward her was a deep, aching pity. Jessica, predictably, shifted into hyper-drive caretaker mode. She spent her evenings managing phone calls, organizing intimidating stacks of legal paperwork, and mediating conversations between Margaret, divorce lawyers, and the realtors tasked with selling her childhood home. The shift in our household dynamic didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, insidiously. It crept in the exact same way a severe thunderstorm rolls across the Ohio plains during the dog days of July. You don't notice the pressure dropping or the sky bruising until you suddenly realize the air is too heavy to breathe. The attic re-entered the narrative about 3 weeks into Margaret's indefinite stay. It was a stifling Saturday morning. The humidity was already hovering near 90% by breakfast. Jessica walked into the kitchen, her hair tied up in a messy, determined bun, and announced that the day of reckoning had arrived. "We are finally clearing out the attic," she declared, pouring herself a massive cup of coffee. "It is driving me absolutely insane knowing all of that mystery junk is just rotting up there above our heads. David, you're the tall one. You are going up." From her seat at the kitchen island, Margaret let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a nice sound, one I hadn't heard much. I remember walking into the hallway, gripping the fraying cord, and yanking the wooden ladder down from the ceiling. The hinges shrieked in protest. The moment the hatch fell open, a physical wave of stale, suffocating heat slammed directly into my face. It smelled deeply of ancient dust, dry rot, and baked pine needles. "Jesus Christ," I called down, already sweating. "It is a literal sauna up here," Jessica yelled back from the living room. "Quit whining and just start handing the boxes down." So I submitted to my fate. For the next grueling hour, I crawled across the treacherous wooden joists of that miserable, unventilated space. The ceiling pitched at a harsh angle, forcing me to hunch over like a gargoyle. I dragged heavy, collapsing cardboard boxes toward the opening, lowering them down into the relatively cooler air of the hallway, while Jessica stacked them against the walls. About halfway through the ordeal, Margaret wandered out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway, looking up through the square hole in the ceiling. "You must be absolutely dying up there," she remarked. Because of the acoustics of the narrow hallway and the cramped attic, her voice sounded incredibly close, almost as if she were whispering directly into my ear. I wiped a layer of grime off my forehead, peering down at her. "I've definitely made worse life choices," I joked, my breathing heavy. "But this is easily top 5. Right at that moment, Jessica's phone began to ring from the kitchen counter. It was the realtor. I heard her groan, grab the phone, and step out onto the front porch to take the call, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. Suddenly, it was just Margaret and me. She stayed there, rooted to the spot in the hallway, looking up at me through the hatch. The strangest thing about that specific moment is that absolutely nothing cinematic occurred. There was no dramatic shift in the lighting, no sudden crescendo of music in my head, no lightning bolt epiphany. But as I crouched there in the sweltering dark, looking down, I found myself noticing specific, granular details about my mother. In-law that I had never allowed my brain to register before. I noticed the way the hallway light caught the elegant streaks of silver woven through her dark hair. I noticed the casual, tired way she leaned one shoulder against the drywall, as if the sheer weight of the past month was physically pressing her down. And, most unnervingly, I noticed the way her dark eyes stayed, locked onto mine just a fraction of a second longer than a normal, polite conversation required. "Do you want some water?" she asked, her voice softening. "Honestly, Margaret, that would actually save my life right now." She vanished into the kitchen and returned a minute later holding a frosted bottle of water. Instead of just reaching up, she placed her bare feet on the wooden rungs and climbed 2 steps up the ladder to hand it to me. The hallway below was dead silent. I could faintly hear the muffled cadence of Jessica's voice outside on the porch, negotiating closing costs. When Margaret looked up at me again, her face was suddenly startlingly close to mine. The oppressive heat from the attic was pouring down through the hatch, enveloping both of us in a heavy, invisible blanket. I could feel a thick bead of sweat track its way down the side of my neck, soaking into the collar of my t-shirt. "You really weren't kidding about the heat," she murmured, her eyes flicking across my face. "It feels like Central Florida up here." She offered a faint, almost melancholy smile. "You should probably take a break." I reached down, our fingers briefly brushing against the cold plastic of the bottle. I unscrewed the cap and downed half the water in 3 massive gulps. "Yeah," I breathed out. "Probably a very good idea." But the problem was, neither of us moved. I didn't retreat back into the shadows of the attic, and she didn't step back down to the hallway floor. We just stayed there, suspended in this strange, heavy pause. It felt as though we were both suddenly acutely aware of a new, dangerous frequency humming in the air. Yet both of us were violently refusing to acknowledge it. Then the front door rattled open. Jessica marched back inside, complaining loudly about escrow, and the strange, suspended bubble popped. Everything snapped violently back to normal. The remainder of the afternoon progressed exactly how a Saturday chore day should. We hauled boxes, sneezed through clouds of dust, and constantly complained about the stifling Ohio heat. By the time the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the lawn, we had managed to clear out roughly half of the attic. That night, utterly exhausted, we ordered 2 large pizzas and collapsed into the living room to watch some terrible reality dating show that Jessica loved to mock. Margaret sat in the armchair, laughing at all the appropriate moments, but something about her posture seemed fundamentally different. She seemed looser, less guarded. It was as if a tightly coiled spring inside her chest had finally been released. I firmly told myself I was projecting. I was overanalyzing a moment of shared exhaustion. But 3 days later, the dynamic shifted from theoretical to practical. Jessica, who worked as a regional sales manager, had to travel to Chicago for a sudden mandatory client meeting. It was a short trip, just 2 nights away, but it was enough. Before the Uber arrived to take her to the airport, she stood in the kitchen and gave her mother a tight, reassuring hug. "You're going to be okay here with David for a couple of days?" Margaret smiled warmly, patting her daughter's back. "Of course, sweetheart. Don't worry about me. Go close your deal." I remember Jessica turning to me, grabbing the lapels of my jacket, and kissing me quickly on the lips, before grabbing the handle of her rolling suitcase and heading out into the humid morning air. The moment her Uber pulled out of the driveway, the energy in the house instantly mutated. It felt strangely cavernous. Quieter, yes, but it was a heavy, expectant kind of quiet. That first evening without Jessica, Margaret offered to make spaghetti. We ate at the small wooden table in the kitchen. We had the windows cranked open, listening to the crickets, because the central air conditioning was failing miserably against the late summer humidity. At first, we navigated safe, shallow waters. We talked about recent movies, the eccentric neighbor across the street, and her vague plans for what she might do once the money from the house sale cleared. But slowly, inevitably, the conversation drifted toward the wreckage of her marriage. She didn't break down. There were no tears, no dramatic proclamations of hatred. She spoke about the divorce with a haunting, detached calmness, the way a person might describe recovering from a long, grueling physical illness. 35 years, she said quietly. Her eyes focused downward as she slowly twirled a forkful of pasta. 35 years of knowing exactly where you belong, knowing exactly who you are supposed to be. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, you just aren't that person anymore. I sat across from her, completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of her grief. I had absolutely no idea what the protocol was for comforting your mother-in-law over a betrayed lifetime. "I am so incredibly sorry, Margaret," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. She stopped twirling her pasta and slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. The look she gave me was uncomfortably intense. "You are a truly good man, David," she said softly. The specific timbre of her voice, the way she deliberately held my gaze, it made my chest tighten sharply, a spike of adrenaline flooding my system that I had no business feeling. Later that night, I was sitting alone on the living room sofa, mindlessly scrolling through channels when I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Margaret came down into the dimly lit room. She had showered and changed into a loose, oversized cotton sleep shirt that draped off one shoulder. "Do you mind if I join you for a bit?" she asked, hovering near the edge of the rug. "Not at all, have a seat." She sat down on the far opposite end of the long sectional couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. The television glowed in the darkness, casting flickering blue light across the room, but I knew instantly that neither of us was paying a shred of attention to the screen. Outside, the weather had finally broken. A violent Midwestern thunderstorm had rolled in off the plains, and the torrential rain was drumming aggressively against the roof shingles. Lightning occasionally flashed, illuminating the living room in stark, brief bursts of white. After maybe 20 minutes of heavy silence, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper over the sound of the rain. "Do you ever feel like your entire life mutates all at once, in the blink of an eye, and you never even saw the warning signs?" I kept my eyes on the television, swallowing hard. "Sometimes, yeah, I think everyone feels that way eventually." She tilted her head back, looking up toward the ceiling, up toward the hallway. "That attic is probably absolutely miserable in this weather. The humidity must be trapped up there." "Definitely," I agreed, my voice raspy. "It is an oven." She nodded very slowly. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about how incredibly hot it was up there the other day." There was a massive yawning pause in the conversation. The rain battered the windows. The silence in the room felt thick enough to choke on. Then she turned her head and looked directly at me, the flickering light from the television reflected in her eyes. "You know," she said, her voice dropping into a register. I had never heard her use. For a brief moment the other day, I actually forgot that I was standing under the roof of the house where my daughter lives. My stomach performed a sickening, violent twist. The air in my lungs vanished. I knew exactly what she meant. The implication was staggering, dangerous, and utterly undeniable. But the absolute worst part, the part that kept me staring blindly at the television screen, terrified to move a single muscle. I hadn't forgotten either. The following morning dawned with that specific surreal quality, where both parties silently agreed to aggressively pretend that the tectonic plates beneath their feet hadn't shifted in the night, except nothing physical had happened. Technically, no boundaries had been overtly breached, but the very oxygen in the space between Margaret and me had fundamentally altered. It had crystallized into something I could feel pressing against my skin. I woke up entirely too early, around 5:30 a.m. I lay flat on my back in my empty marital bed, staring blankly at the slow rotation of the ceiling fan. My brain was locked in a torturous, repeating loop, replaying every single microsecond of the interaction on the couch, the exact cadence of her voice, the specific angle of her neck. For a brief moment, I actually forgot. For a few desperate seconds, I tried to convince my sleep-deprived brain that I had entirely manufactured the subtext, that I was projecting my own weird latent stress onto an innocent, grieving woman. Then I heard her bare feet padding softly across the kitchen floor directly beneath my bedroom, slow, deliberate, the same quiet, ghostly way she had moved through our home since the day she arrived with her suitcases. I dragged myself out of bed, threw on a faded gray t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, and walked down the hallway. The hardwood floors creaked under my weight. I found her standing at the kitchen counter, meticulously pouring water into the coffee maker. The early morning summer sun was beginning to bleed through the window above the sink, catching the edges of her profile in a halo of golden light. She paused when she heard my footsteps. "Morning," she said. Her tone was flawless. It was a masterclass in normalcy. It was, in fact, entirely too normal. "Morning," I croaked out, my throat dry. There was a painful, agonizingly long pause as I retrieved my own mug from the cabinet and poured a cup. We didn't look at each other. We didn't mention the rain, the couch, or the conversation. We retreated to the safest, most mundane topics available to two human beings. We discussed the severity of the overnight storm. We speculated on whether Jessica's early morning meetings in Chicago were going well. We spoke with the stiff, rehearsed cadence of two underprepared actors, reading lines from a teleprompter. But beneath the banal dialogue, there was a deafening electric hum vibrating between us, a hyper-awareness that made the simple act of reaching for the sugar bowl feel like a loaded gesture. Every breath, every shift in weight, felt monumental. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, the stifling heat in the house reached its peak. The air conditioner finally gave up entirely, clicking off with a pathetic wheeze. Margaret walked into the living room, where I was pretending to answer work emails on my laptop. "I'd like to finish clearing out the attic," she announced. I stopped typing. Jessica had texted me an hour prior, complaining that she would be locked in endless corporate strategy sessions until late evening. My original plan had been to order takeout, work until 8, and maybe tackle the remaining boxes on Sunday when Jessica returned. But Margaret wasn't asking for my schedule. She walked out of the living room and stood in the hallway, staring intently up at the closed hatch in the ceiling. "We left a significant amount of junk up there in the back corner," she noted, her back to me. "Yeah, we did," I replied cautiously, closing my laptop. "But I can just knock it out later, or tomorrow. I could help you." I hesitated, standing up from the sofa. The visceral memory of that suffocating heat, of her standing 2 rungs up on the ladder, came rushing back into my frontal lobe like a physical blow. "You really don't have to do that, Margaret," I warned her, stepping into the hallway. "It is absolutely miserable up there, especially today. The humidity is worse than Saturday." She turned her head, offering me a faint, unreadable smile. "David, I promise you, I have lived through significantly worse environments." Before my rational brain could slam the emergency brakes, my hands were already reaching for the cord. I yanked the ladder down. As expected, the attic violently exhaled. A wave of thick, stale, dusty air rolled over us, carrying the scent of dry rot and old memories. "Still feel like Florida up there?" she asked, looking up into the gloom. "Worse, it's the Everglades today." I scrambled up the wooden rungs first, immediately feeling the sweat prickle against my scalp. I navigated the wooden joists, avoiding the fluffy pink insulation, and began dragging the final cluster of boxes toward the glowing square of the hatch. Dust motes danced erratically in the narrow, blinding beams of sunlight that pierced through the wooden slats of the roof vents. A minute later, the wooden ladder groaned beneath a new weight. Margaret climbed halfway up, positioning herself so her torso was in the attic, while her legs remained on the ladder. She reached out, taking the dusty boxes from my hands and lowering them blindly into the hallway. For 20 minutes we operated like a silent, efficient machine. The only sounds were the scraping of cardboard against wood and our increasingly heavy breathing. The atmosphere up there was punishing. Within 10 minutes, the back of my t-shirt was entirely plastered to my skin, saturated with sweat. "You weren't exaggerating," she gasped, wiping her forehead with the back of a dusty hand. "It literally feels like the house is breathing heat onto us." She paused, looking past me into the dark recesses of the attic. "Can I come all the way up?" The question caught me violently off guard. I paused. A heavy box balanced on my knee. "It is really not safe," I cautioned, my voice tight. "There is barely any floorboards. There are exposed roofing nails everywhere, and the ceiling pitches down. You can't even stand up straight. I'll be careful." There was something resolute in her tone, a quiet defiance that stripped away any authority I thought I had to tell her. "No." I slowly shifted my weight, stepping back onto a sturdy beam to make room. Margaret climbed the remaining rungs with careful precision and hauled herself up onto the plywood platform beside the hatch. The physical space was brutally small. Seen from below, the attic looked expansive. Up here, trapped beneath the sharp V of the roofline, it felt like a coffin. We were forced to crouch on our hands and knees, our heads bowed. The air was stagnant, heavy, and motionless. Within seconds of her joining me, the humidity seemed to double, wrapping around both of us like a wet, suffocating wool blanket. "Wow," she breathed softly, looking around at the shadowy rafters. "Told you." We shared a brief, breathless laugh. It felt completely natural for a split second. Then we returned to the boxes. About 5 minutes later, as she reached forward to drag a heavy plastic tote toward the opening, she lost her balance. She pitched forward slightly, throwing her hand out to brace herself against the wooden beam separating us. Her forearm brushed heavily against my bicep. It was, in all likelihood, an entirely accidental gesture born of clumsy footing. But what wasn't accidental was the aftermath. Neither of us recoiled. Neither of us muttered a quick apology or pulled away. We stayed frozen, our skin touching in the sweltering heat. Time seemed to drag to a gelatinous halt. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the thumping of my own pulse. "Yeah." She turned her head slowly to look at me. The polite, composed mask she had worn for 3 weeks was entirely gone. In its place was an expression of deep, profound exhaustion and terrifying vulnerability. "Do you know what the absolute strangest part of getting a divorce is?" she asked quietly, her eyes locked onto mine. "Like, if they speak too loudly, you'll shatter into a million pieces." I swallowed hard, feeling the sweat dripping down my temples. "Maybe they're just trying to be compassionate. They know you are hurting." She slowly shook her head, strands of hair sticking to her damp cheek. "It is infinitely worse than that." She shifted her weight on the plywood, moving an inch closer to me, abandoning any pretense of reaching for the box. "I spent 35 years of my life being someone's wife," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I was a routine. I was a certainty. I was a piece of furniture in a house he eventually got bored of." She drew in a shaky breath. "And then, one random Tuesday, the paperwork is signed, and you are just a woman, standing entirely alone in a massive, quiet house, realizing that the best years of your life were spent building a monument to someone who didn't want to live in it anymore." The ancient wood of the attic creaked ominously around us as a hot gust of wind hit the roof outside. I sat there, paralyzed. There is no script for this. There is no right thing to say when your wife's mother unloads decades of crushed dreams at your feet in a 100-degree room. She stared down at her dust, covered hands. "Do you know what else happens, David?" "What?" I rasped. "You suddenly realize exactly how many years it has been since a man looked at you like you were actually alive." The sentence dropped into the cramped space between us like a lead weight. It was devastating. It was terrifying, and I felt a dark, uncomfortable thrill move violently through my chest. "Margaret," I started, desperate to reclaim the high ground, to be the voice of reason. "I am not saying you did anything wrong. Your husband made a terrible mistake." She cut me off, her voice dropping into a soft, fierce whisper. "I am not talking about my husband. I just noticed it the other day." The temperature in the attic seemed to spike 20 degrees. "I noticed that you noticed me." Every single alarm bell in my nervous system began screaming in unison. This was the exact moment to deploy the eject button. I needed to stand up, bang my head on the rafters, scramble down the ladder, and walk out the front door until my blood cooled down. Instead, I remained frozen, because the horrific, undeniable truth was that she was absolutely right. I had noticed. It hadn't been malicious, and it certainly hadn't been premeditated. But once the intrusive thought had breached my consciousness, it had taken root. It was impossible to unsee her. She looked away, suddenly ashamed, pulling her arm back. "I shouldn't have said that. Please forget I said that." The heavy, suffocating silence stretched out, tightening around my throat. "You are going through a massive trauma," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "It is messing with your head." She let out a small, incredibly sad, self-deprecating laugh. "That is an exceptionally polite way of saying that I am a pathetic mess." "I didn't say that." "But you thought it." She wiped her eyes, taking a deep, fortifying breath, trying to reconstruct her armor. She looked back at me, her eyes fierce. "Don't worry, David. I am not going to ruin my daughter's marriage just because I am lonely." The words struck me like a physical slap across the face. Not because of the reassurance, but because by saying it out loud, she had manifested the concept into reality. The idea of ruin, the idea of betrayal. It was no longer a vague, unspoken tension. It was a named entity sitting in the dark with us. I panicked. I pushed myself backward too fast, trying to stand up, and the back of my skull slammed hard against a low wooden beam. "Jesus!" I hissed, grabbing my head. Margaret gasped, then let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Oh my God, careful." I rubbed the sore spot, forcing a shaky laugh of my own. "Okay, that is a sign. We should definitely take a break before I give myself a concussion." "That is probably very wise," she agreed. But history repeating itself, neither of us made a move toward the ladder. We sat there in the gloom. The only sound was the harsh, rapid sound of our own breathing. Finally, Margaret placed her hands on her knees and pushed herself up into a crouch. She brushed the thick layer of dust off her shorts. She looked down at me, her silhouette framed by the glowing square of the hallway light beneath her. "You know what the absolute worst part of getting older is?" she asked quietly. "What?" "You are still the exact same person inside," she said, her voice filled with a desperate intensity. "You have the exact same desires, the exact same capacity to love, the exact same needs." She paused, her eyes searching my face in the shadows. "But the rest of the world unilaterally decides that you are now invisible." My throat was parched. "Margaret, you are not invisible." The millisecond those words left my mouth, a wave of profound regret washed over me. Because it wasn't a comfort, it was an admission, it was an invitation. She studied my face for a long, terrifying moment, looking for any trace of pity or hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered softly. She turned and began the slow, careful descent down the ladder. I remained in the attic for a full 2 minutes after she left, sitting in the sweltering dark, staring blankly at the rough wood grain of the rafters, desperately hoping they would offer some kind of moral clarity. They remained silent. When I finally forced myself to climb down, my legs feeling like lead, I found Margaret standing in the hallway, aggressively fanning herself with a glossy junk mail catalog. The air conditioning in this hallway, suddenly feels like a miracle," she noted, not looking at me. "It does." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a fraction of a second, the overwhelming claustrophobic intimacy of that cramped attic space hung suspended in the cool hallway air between us, a massive piece of unfinished business. We dragged the remaining boxes out to the garage in absolute punishing silence. That evening, I retreated to my office, desperately trying to convince my fractured conscience that the tension would evaporate overnight. Tomorrow, Jessica's flight would land. She would walk through the front door, the dynamic of the house would reset to its natural state, and this bizarre, feverish 2-day hallucination would be buried forever. But shortly after midnight, I woke from a fitful, shallow sleep. My mouth felt like it was full of sand. I threw off the tangled sheets and walked barefoot into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was pitch black, save for the weak, yellowish glow of the small light above the stove. Margaret was sitting alone at the kitchen island. She didn't flinch when I walked in. She just slowly turned her head. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Not really." She gestured with an elegant, manicured hand to the empty bar stool beside her. "Me neither." I filled a glass from the tap, and against every surviving instinct I possessed, sat down next to her. The silence stretched out for a full minute. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the background. Then she delivered the killing blow. "Do you know what I realized this afternoon, David?" "What?" She leaned back slightly, resting her elbows on the cool marble of the counter. She didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead into the darkness of the living room. "That attic, it makes you forget things." My brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She finally turned her head, fixing me with a look of terrifying clarity. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "For about 10 minutes up there today, I completely forgot that you were my daughter's husband." My pulse skyrocketed, hammering violently against my ribs. The kitchen suddenly felt as small and airless as the space beneath the roof. She didn't blink. "And I think you forgot, too." I couldn't speak. My jaw was locked shut because she hadn't said it like a dark joke. She hadn't said it as a passing shameful thought. She had delivered it as an absolute, undeniable truth, a mutual confession, and somewhere deep in the reptilian part of my brain, an incredibly dangerous, ruinous thought began to solidify. Jessica wouldn't be home for another 14 hours. I didn't sleep a single minute for the rest of the night. I retreated to my bed around 1 a.m., but my mind was a chaotic war zone. I lay flat on my back, my eyes burning in the darkness, replaying the exact cadence of her whisper over and over again. "I think you forgot, too." Around sunrise, I drifted into a hallucinatory half-sleep. The morning light eventually crept through the blinds, painting thin, bright stripes across the rumpled duvet. I rolled over. The space where Jessica usually slept was perfectly pristine, untouched since she left. For a fleeting, desperate moment, I tried to convince myself that the midnight kitchen conversation had been a literal nightmare born of stress and heat exhaustion. Then I walked out into the kitchen. Margaret was already there. She was standing by the coffee maker, engaging in the exact same quiet, methodical routine as the morning prior. The same perfect posture, the same infuriating calmness. But this time I saw everything differently. She was wearing a simple, loose gray tank top and a pair of faded cotton lounge shorts. It was incredibly mundane. It was an outfit you would wear to paint a bedroom or lounge on a lazy Sunday. It was entirely appropriate for family. But the damage was already done. The filter in my brain had been irrevocably altered. Once you allow yourself to view someone through a specific forbidden lens, you can never unsee the picture. "Good morning," she said softly, hearing my footsteps. "Morning." I moved to the cabinet, my hands actually shaking as I reached for a mug. The physical manifestation of my guilt infuriated me. We stood shoulder to shoulder at the granite counter in suffocating silence. Then, in a voice as casual as if she were asking for the sugar, she said, "I was thinking about the attic again." I let out a harsh, involuntary breath, gripping the edge of the counter. "Of course you were." She offered a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. "It is difficult not to." I leaned my weight against the counter, refusing to look at her. "We basically finished it yesterday. There's barely anything left up there." "There is still that one corner in the far back," she countered smoothly. A devastating pause followed. The air in the kitchen grew heavy. "Margaret, you do not have to help me with that," I said, my voice thick. "I know." She didn't say anything else. She didn't offer a justification. She simply picked up her steaming mug, took a slow, deliberate sip, and stared up at the ceiling. "Have you ever noticed," she murmured thoughtfully, "how certain spaces in a house feel completely disconnected from the rest of the building?" "What do you mean?" "Like they exist on a different plane. Like they belong to a completely different version of reality, where the normal rules of the house don't apply." I rubbed my eyes aggressively, with the heels of my hands, trying to rub away the exhaustion and the temptation. "You mean like a creepy basement in a horror movie?" She laughed softly, a beautiful, tragic sound. "Something like that. That attic, it feels exactly like that." God help me, I knew exactly what she meant. From the moment we had found ourselves crammed together in that suffocating, oppressive heat, it felt as though we had stepped through a portal. It was a sensory deprivation chamber that stripped away our titles: husband, mother, in-law, homeowner, guest, and left only raw, desperate human instinct. "You are dangerously overthinking it," I told her, my voice lacking any real conviction. She tilted her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Am I?" The look she gave me lasted for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, without breaking eye contact, she set her mug down on the counter with a quiet click. "Well," she said smoothly, brushing her hands against her shorts, "I am going up there right now to finish that corner." I stood frozen by the coffee maker, watching her walk purposefully down the hallway. "You shouldn't go up there alone," I called out after her, desperation leaking into my tone. She paused at the foot of the closed trapdoor. She slowly turned around to face me. A tiny, sad, almost fatalistic smile played across her lips. "Then I suppose you better come up with me." That was the exact moment. That was the crossroads. That was the final exit ramp before the cliff. I could have walked out the back door and driven aimlessly around the Ohio suburbs until Jessica landed. I could have locked myself in the bathroom. I could have done literally anything else in the world. Instead, like a man walking to the gallows, I followed her. The wooden ladder shrieked as I yanked it down from the ceiling. Instantly, the stagnant, boiling air of the attic flooded the hallway. The humidity was visibly thick. Margaret looked up into the darkness. "That heat is genuinely unbelievable." "Yeah." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the rungs. "You first." "No," she said calmly, refusing to move. "You are taller, you go." So, I climbed into the oven first. The storm from the previous night had trapped a suffocating layer of moisture beneath the roof. It felt like breathing through a hot, wet towel. Within seconds, my gray t-shirt was clinging uncomfortably to my back. I crawled over the joists, shoving the final 3 cardboard boxes toward the center of the room. Below me, the ladder creaked loudly. Margaret ascended slowly, gracefully pulling herself up onto the plywood platform. She crouched directly beside me. The space was so comically small that our shoulders were forced to press against each other. For 5 minutes, we engaged in the charade of organizing. We handed dusty lampshades and heavy boxes of old college textbooks toward the opening. We didn't speak, but the silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was highly combustible. It was soaked in gasoline, just waiting for a spark. I reached behind me to grab a box of old records. As I pulled it forward, Margaret leaned in the opposite direction to grab a stack of magazines. Her chest brushed firmly against my arm. She didn't pull away. I didn't flinch. "You are completely sweating through your shirt," she noted quietly, her voice sounding raspy in the dry air. "It is easily 110 degrees up here." She nodded very slowly. Her face was hovering inches from mine. In the dim, dusty light filtering through the roof vents, I could see the tiny, elegant lines around the corners of her eyes, the kind of intimate, beautiful imperfections you can only witness when you are terrifyingly close to another human being. "You know what is so strange about this," she whispered. My heart was beating so violently I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "This heat, it makes everything feel like it is moving in slow motion." She dragged her eyes away from mine, looking toward the glowing square of the hatch, where the safe, air-conditioned reality of her daughter's house waited. Then she looked back at me, and it is so incredibly quiet. For a long, unbroken minute, we just stared at each other. There is a very specific, horrifying moment in life where you suddenly realize that an irreversible, catastrophic event is no longer a possibility. It is an absolute certainty. You feel the gravity shift before the impact happens. You are standing on the edge of the precipice, and you realize you have already started to lean forward. My rational brain was screaming at a deafening volume. This was sheer insanity. This was Jessica's mother. My wife, the woman who loved me, who trusted me implicitly, who was currently boarding a plane to come back to the home we built together. But the attic didn't care about Jessica. The attic was a sealed vault. The oppressive heat, the isolation, the heavy dead air pressing violently against our skin. It stripped everything away until there was nothing left but the terrifying proximity of her body. Margaret exhaled a long, shaky breath. "You really should go downstairs, David," she murmured softly. The words were constructed as a warning, but her tone was a plea, and she didn't shift an inch away from me. "You should too," I rasped. A heavy, breathless pause. Then she leaned in, her voice dropping into a desperate whisper that completely shattered the remaining distance between us. "But I don't think either of us actually wants to. I should have thrown myself backward. I should have scrambled down the ladder so fast I broke an ankle. Instead, I stayed anchored to the plywood." Her right hand moved slowly. It came to rest incredibly lightly against the rough wooden joist positioned an inch from my knee. The heat radiating off her skin was palpable. "David," she breathed. Just hearing my own name spoken in that breathless, pleading tone caused my stomach to drop into a bottomless gorge. "Yes?" She searched my eyes frantically, as if she were begging me for permission to pull the pin on the grenade she was holding. "This is a spectacularly terrible idea." I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I know." Neither of us moved. The house groaned beneath us as the wind shifted. Margaret's voice was barely a vibration in the air. "Your wife trusts me completely." "I know." "She trusts you even more." "I know." Her dark eyes locked onto mine, filled with a mixture of terror and overwhelming desire. "But for the last 48 hours," she whispered, a tear forming in the corner of her eye, "I haven't been able to think about a single goddamn thing except this attic." The confession hung in the sweltering air between us, heavy and damning. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "You aren't the only one," I admitted hoarsely. And that was the exact second the dam finally burst. It wasn't like the movies. There was no sudden, passionate lunging. There was no sweeping, cinematic embrace. It was just a quiet, inevitable surrender to a current we had both already waded far too deep into. Margaret closed her eyes tightly, as if bracing for an impact. "Just for a moment," she murmured, almost to herself. When she opened her eyes, she leaned forward. She was so agonizingly close that I was breathing in the carbon dioxide she exhaled. The attic felt like it was physically shrinking. compressing the entire universe down into this tiny, dark, suffocating wooden box one moment. That was the lie we both silently agreed to tell ourselves. But as our faces drifted together, a terrifying, paralyzing realization struck me. We hadn't forgotten Jessica. We hadn't forgotten her for a single solitary second. We knew exactly who we were, and we knew exactly whose house we were in. And somehow, the knowledge of the betrayal made the gravity of the moment infinitely heavier. There is a terrifying stillness that occurs in the fraction of a second before you commit an act you know will irrevocably ruin your life. Your brain kindly offers you a panoramic view of all the exits. It vividly projects the next 10 years of your life, the happy anniversaries, the children, the quiet Sunday mornings, the beautiful timeline that will continue to exist if you simply stand up, apologize, and walk away. I saw all of it, every consequence, and I still didn't move. When our lips finally met, the world outside the attic ceased to exist. But the reality of what we were doing crashed down on me with the force of an anvil. The kiss was hesitant at first, driven by equal parts terror and a dark, suffocating curiosity. It tasted of salt and dust and profound, catastrophic mistake. This was Margaret, the woman who had proudly watched me slip a ring onto her daughter's finger, and I was kissing her in the sweltering dark, hidden away like a coward in the ceiling of the home my wife and I had built. Margaret broke it first. She pulled back sharply, her breath hitching wildly in her chest. "We can't," she gasped, her hands trembling as she grabbed her own shoulders. The calm, composed, elegant mother-in-law was entirely gone. She looked terrified. "I know," I breathed, my heart threatening to crack my ribs. But the horrifying truth was that neither of us scrambled away. We stayed crouched together, the suffocating heat wrapping around us, staring at each other with wide, panicked eyes. We had crossed a massive, invisible line, detonating a bomb that we had been aggressively pretending wasn't ticking. "I am so sorry," she whispered, burying her face in her dusty hands. "For what? For even letting it get to this point. Margaret, you didn't force this to happen alone." She lowered her hands, looking at me with an expression of such raw, devastating honesty that it made me want to vanish. "I think I knew the exact second I climbed onto that ladder today," she confessed, her voice shaking. The weight of the admission crushed the breath out of me. "You planned it?" She violently shook her head. "No, God, no, David, not like that." She wiped the sweat from her cheek, smearing a streak of dirt across her pale skin. But I knew that something terrible was building between us. I could feel it, and instead of packing my bags and leaving, she looked around the cramped, shadowy rafters. I actively came back up to the only place in the house where it felt real. A heavy, mournful silence fell over the attic. The deed was done. The air had been breached. She looked back at me, her eyes hardening with a desperate resolve. "We stop right now." It wasn't a question, it was a mandate. I nodded slowly, feeling numb. "Yeah, we stop." But the fundamental problem with crossing a forbidden boundary is that once you step onto the other side, the bridge behind you immediately burns. You can't just step back. The ground is gone. We climbed down the wooden ladder one after the other, moving like two traumatized survivors fleeing a disaster zone. As my feet hit the hallway floor, the air-conditioned air hit my sweat-soaked shirt, making me shiver violently. For a brief, delusional second, looking at the familiar beige paint and the family photos on the wall, it almost felt like the last 20 minutes could be erased. Margaret stood near the guest room door, aggressively brushing dust off her shorts. She let out a small, incredibly hollow laugh. "Well," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "that attic is officially completely empty." Yeah. We stood there in agonizing awkwardness. Two people who had just quietly detonated a nuclear warhead in the geographical center of a happy home. I am going to go take a very long shower, she said finally, unable to look me in the eye. That is probably a good idea. She turned the doorknob, then paused. She looked back over her shoulder. David. Yeah? Her voice softened, cracking with genuine despair. We really, truly do stop now. I know, Margaret, I know. She slipped into the guest bedroom, the door clicking shut firmly behind her. I was left standing entirely alone in the hallway, staring blankly up at the wooden square in the ceiling. 3 hours later, my cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Jessica. Hey babe, she chirped cheerfully, though she sounded exhausted. Meetings ran late, but I have amazing news. I managed to score a seat on a super early flight tomorrow morning. My stomach, already a knot of sheer anxiety, plummeted straight into the floorboards. Oh yeah, that is great. Yeah, I'll be landing by 10. I should be pulling into the driveway by noon. I could hear the chaotic, echoing announcements of the Chicago airport in the background. How are things there? How is my mom holding up? The innocent question hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. She is doing really well, I stammered carefully, staring at the floor. We actually finished completely cleaning out the attic today. Jessica let out a loud, delighted laugh. Oh, thank God, that creepy place was driving me absolutely insane. You are the best, David. I forced out a dry, hacking chuckle. Yeah, babe, it is totally done. That night, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. It felt as though gravity had doubled. Margaret and I sat across from each other at the dinner table, pushing food around our plates, engaging in agonizingly superficial conversation about Jessica's impending arrival. We discussed airport traffic and grocery lists, but every few minutes our eyes would accidentally meet across the table, and every single time they did, the phantom heat of that dark attic rushed back over my skin, suffocating me all over again. Promptly at 9:30 p.m., she stood up from the table. I am going to bed early, she announced rigidly. Okay. She walked quickly toward the hallway. Right before she reached her door, she stopped. Good night, David. Good night. She vanished. I spent the next 2 hours pacing the living room like a caged animal, the television playing silently to an empty room. When I finally collapsed into bed, sleep was impossible. My mind was a relentless projector, playing the exact moment her lips touched mine on an endless, torturous loop. But the absolute most terrifying part of lying awake in the dark wasn't the memory of the kiss. The truly horrifying part was a realization I hadn't yet fully confessed to myself. In the exact moment it was happening, crammed in the sweltering heat, risking the total destruction of my marriage and my life. It hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt tragically, completely inevitable. The next morning, Jessica came home. I was standing by the kitchen island when I heard the distinct, rhythmic clack of her suitcase wheels rolling across the concrete porch. The sound felt surreal, like a sound effect from a movie I wasn't supposed to be in. The front door swung open. Hey, I am back, Jessica yelled happily, dumping her purse on the console table. She walked into the kitchen, a bright smile on her tired face, and immediately threw her arms around Margaret, who was standing by the sink. I missed you so much, Mom, Jessica said, burying her face in Margaret's shoulder. I missed you too, sweetheart, Margaret replied. Her voice was steady. It was warm. It was flawlessly, chillingly normal. Then Jessica turned, her face lighting up, and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck. Did you manage to survive 2 whole days without me? Barely, I croaked. She laughed a bright, beautiful laugh, and kissed me deeply on the mouth. For a fleeting second, feeling the warmth of my wife against me, I felt like the most despicable, irredeemable monster currently walking the face of the earth. Jessica pulled back, stepping out of my arms and looking around the pristine kitchen. The house looks amazing. You guys kept it spotless. We got a lot of chores knocked out, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Her eyes drifted out to the hallway, looking toward the ceiling. You seriously conquered the attic? Yep, Margaret said calmly, pouring a cup of coffee. All finished, not a single box left, Jessica beamed. Thank God. She started walking toward the stairs to unpack, glancing up at the closed wooden hatch. You guys actually went up into that torture chamber together. My chest seized so hard I thought my ribs would crack. Yeah, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Mostly just me doing the heavy lifting, though. Jessica shook her head, laughing in disbelief. I bet it was 1,000,000 degrees up there near the roof. Margaret and I exchanged a microsecond glance, a glance that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken sins. Pretty close, Margaret agreed softly, taking a sip of her coffee. Jessica stretched her arms over her head, yawning widely. All right, I am taking a massively long shower. Chicago airport air is disgusting. She jogged up the stairs, humming a pop song under her breath. The absolute second her bedroom door clicked shut upstairs, the devastating silence between Margaret and me slammed violently back into place. Neither of us dared to breathe. Neither of us moved. After 30 agonizing seconds, Margaret quietly picked up her ceramic mug, turned her back to me, and walked out through the sliding glass door onto the back porch. I stayed rooted to the kitchen floor, staring blindly out into the hallway. From below, that attic hatch looked entirely mundane. It was just a cheap square piece of painted plywood, with a frayed string hanging from it. It was completely ordinary. But I knew the horrifying truth about it now, because somewhere up there, hidden beneath the shingles, trapped in that suffocating heat and dead silence, Margaret and I had forged something dark and ruinous that fundamentally did not belong in this happy home. And no matter how brilliantly we acted, no matter how flawlessly normal our morning routines appeared, we both knew exactly what had transpired in the dark. And as I stood there listening to the water running in my wife's shower, a much darker, much colder realization settled into my bones. The attic was never the actual problem. The problem was that Margaret and I were still living, breathing, and sleeping under the exact same roof. And the memory of that sweltering, forbidden moment wasn't going to remain trapped in the ceiling. It wasn't going anywhere. Not for her, not for me, not ever.